wait a second. Because while Donald Trump was brushing off Canada like it was an afterthought, something very different was happening on the other side of the world. Planes touching down in Beijing, red carpets rolled out, senior Chinese officials standing at attention, cameras flashing, and at the center of it all, Mark Carney, stepping onto Chinese soil as the first Canadian Prime Minister to make that trip in 8 years.
No real advantage to us. It's irrelevant to me. Canada would love it. Canada wants it. They need it because we don't need Canada product. That's the thing. You know, I want to be a nice person, but we don't need. I want to build the cars here, not in Canada. We used to build cars in Canada. Now, the Canada cars, the Canadians are moving here to build cars. Same thing with Mexico. Same thing with Japan. Japan's paid us billions and billions of dollars for the privilege of making cars here and selling.
Personally invited by President Xi Jinping. Two moments unfolding at the same time. One leader saying, "It's irrelevant to me." Another being treated like a strategic partner. And that contrast? That's the part that really matters. Let's start with what Trump actually said, because the tone tells you more than the words themselves. When asked about Canada and trade, he waved it off, said the US doesn't need Canada, claimed America doesn't need Canadian cars, insisted everything should be built in the United States. Framed it like Canada would be desperate without access to the US market. But here's where things get interesting. That wasn't confidence. That was irritation. Whenever Trump says something doesn't matter, it usually means he feels it slipping out of his control. And this time, the timing made it impossible to ignore. While he was downplaying Canada, Beijing was doing the exact opposite, elevating Canada's prime minister with full state-level treatment. That kind of welcome is never accidental. It's a message. And it wasn't just meant for Ottawa. Beijing was signaling to Washington that Canada is no longer locked into a single economic lane, that it has options. And in global politics, options are power. To understand why this rattles Trump, you have to look at how US leverage over Canada has worked for years. The assumption was simple. Canada depends on the US market so heavily that no matter how aggressive Washington got, Ottawa would eventually fold. Tariffs, auto threats, trade deal pressure. It all worked because Canada had nowhere else to go at scale. That assumption is now cracking. Mark Carney represents a different kind of leadership, especially in the eyes of global markets. He's seen as predictable, process-driven, someone who respects agreements and understands trade-offs instead of governing by threat. In a world where US policy can swing wildly depending on domestic politics, that kind of stability suddenly becomes very attractive. That's why Beijing didn't just host him. They elevated him. State language, reset talk, repeated references to rebuilding Canada-China relations. None of that happens unless China sees long-term strategic value, and from Beijing's perspective, the value is obvious. Canada is resource-rich, politically stable, close to the US border, and now, increasingly willing to diversify rather than stay economically exposed to one unpredictable partner. That combination is powerful. Almost on cue, Trump reacted. He dismissed the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, saying Canada needs it more than the US, claimed American manufacturing would be fine without Canadian input. But here's the part most people miss. The frustration wasn't about cars or trade text. It was about leverage. Pressure only works when the other side has no alternatives. Threats only land when the target is isolated, and for the first time in decades, Canada is actively removing that vulnerability. Europe has been re-engaging. Asian markets are opening wider, and now China, the world's second-largest economy, is not just talking to Canada, but welcoming its prime minister at the highest level. That shifts the balance. When Trump dismisses Canadian manufacturing, he's not projecting strength. He's signaling that the old pressure tactics are losing their bite. Canada is no longer negotiating from fear.
Trade and tariffs are expected to top the agenda. Many embattled industries hoping that this trip leads to some relief on Chinese tariffs on agricultural products in this country. Meanwhile, in the auto industry, concern that that kind of relief could be tied to the lifting of Canadian tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. Carney's visit comes as his government faces increasing pressure to forge new trade alliances.
Now here's the twist that really changes the stakes. Electric vehicles. China isn't just interested in exporting EVs. They want to build them. Factories, battery supply chains, processing infrastructure. And Canada is suddenly very attractive for all of it. Cheap energy, skilled labor, proximity to the US market, political stability. If Chinese EVs are built in Canada, they don't have to cross the Pacific. They sit right next to the US border, competing on price, technology, and scale. And that's a nightmare scenario for an American auto industry that's already struggling to keep pace globally. This is why Trump's tone hardens. This is why he lashes out. Not because Canada is weak, but because Canada is becoming strategically inconvenient. And it doesn't stop with autos. Agriculture is another pressure point, and one that's been quietly hurting Canadian farmers for years. Canola, seafood, pork. Entire sectors caught in retaliatory trade measures that left Ottawa with limited room to maneuver. For a long time, Canada had to absorb the pain because pushing back risked escalation it couldn't afford. That's changing too. Carney's team is pushing hard on agricultural access during this visit. Even incremental movement on canola would be a big deal. Not because it solves everything overnight, but because it proves something crucial. Trade retaliation isn't permanent, and diversification actually works. From Beijing's side, stabilizing agricultural trade with Canada makes sense. It secures supply, it reduces friction, and it builds goodwill with a country that now has more bargaining power than it did a few years ago. And from Ottawa's perspective, it changes the psychology of negotiation. Canada no longer has to rush, no longer has to concede out of fear. It can be patient, calm, strategic. This is where the tension really comes from. Trump's entire approach relies on the idea that economic pressure will force compliance. But that only works if the target is boxed in. Carney is unboxing Canada in real time. And notice what he's not doing. He's not cutting ties with the United States. He's not choosing China over Washington. He's doing something far more disruptive to Trump's strategy. He's making Canada optional. Optional to pressure. Optional to coercion. Optional to threats. Once a country reaches that point, intimidation stops working. That's why this visit isn't about symbolism or spectacle, even though the optics are loud. It's about protection. About making sure Canada is never hostage to the political mood swings of a single partner again. That's why Europe matters. That's why Asia matters. That's why China matters, even when the relationship is complicated. Diversification isn't ideological, it's defensive. A country with options negotiates differently. A country with options can say no without panicking. A country with options doesn't flinch every time a president gets irritated on a podium. And that's the real shift happening here. Donald Trump can say, Canada doesn't matter. But the world is responding as if it does. A Canadian Prime Minister welcomed at the highest level in Beijing. A US President reacting from the sidelines. And a global economy quietly adjusting to a new reality where Canada is no longer waiting for permission to move. Under Mark Carney, Canada isn't rushing, posturing, or grandstanding. It's moving deliberately, confidently, and with a clear understanding that vulnerability is the real weakness. That's what unsettles Trump. Not defiance, not insults, but independence. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.